So welcome. Another of my special interviews on Fencing Bear at Prayer. I'm very happy to welcome back John Moran, author of Resurrection Mantra. John and I are hoping to share with everyone some meditations on the significance of what we're all living through in the world right now with the coronavirus and the fears that people have, obviously, of the things that are going to be changing in our lives and how we are going to come out of this crisis. And John, with his book, The Resurrection Mantra, you remember from my previous video, we talked about how using the mantra can help us through our own personal life crises. And he and I were hoping to share some meditation on how this mantra may actually help our society in this I don't think it's unprecedented moment. The world's been through these sorts of transitions and transformations before, but in any case, welcome. And John, thank you for coming back and talking more about resurrection.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, I look forward to this. I think it's as you say, it's not really an unprecedented time, but it's certainly unprecedented for many people who are living through it. It's certainly in their own personal experience, it's unprecedented because it's probably been the Second World War since we had a major international crisis at this level. But as you say,
yes, well, it's certainly. So, I mean, so I'm 55, and I believe you're older than I am. Yes.
Yeah, a couple of years. Yeah.
The things that my generation that we lived through the ending of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which at the moment, at that time in 1989 was considered a massive transformation. Through 9/11, again, one of those moments when like the world held its breath trying to understand who we were. And now, some 19 years later, a transformation yet again. And I'd say, so personally, I was thinking about this, the biggest, the thing that I feel is most analogous for myself to what we're living through was when my father died. And you sort of go from one day, like, my father died of a stroke, so it was very, very rapid. But, the beginning of the week he was in hospital and possibly recovering. By the end of the week he was dead. And everything changed for me, right? It was like this horrible caesura in my life. And to say you're going to recover from it, you're going to have a life after this, I wouldn't have believed you for months, right? And I think what I've been experiencing to a certain extent in the last week or few weeks is that sense of just the grief of what happens when your entire future changes. You have no clue what's coming.
And to some extent, I mean, you've still got a job, even though it's changed. I went down to to the bank the other day, on Monday it was, and I'm sitting there with my son. I'm in the car and he's out at the automatic teller machine, and I'm looking around, and it was Monday afternoon, and I'm in this busy strip shopping area, traditionally busy strip shopping area. And I looked around and I thought it felt like Christmas Day. One of those days when the genuine days when everything's closed, and after lunch, some people are sleeping off a big Christmas lunch, or some people are out walking their dogs, and the place just has that kind of feeling of silence and everything. That's how it felt. I thought this feels like a Christmas Day or a Good Friday, and it was Monday afternoon. Mm-hmm. The whole place was just closed. Restaurants just shut it up. Coffee shops just shut it up. So those people have, I mean, as I say, you're still in work, and a lot of people are still in work. Those people, for example, have gone from having a business a week before,
right, to
sitting at home with closed shops and nothing.
Well, I've been quite mindful of that. There was a study that some of the University of Chicago Business School professors did. I mean, everybody's paying attention to this right now. They calculating something like 30% of the workforce can carry on with our occupations, online at distance. But that means 70% either are carrying on working, and I'm interested, to think about, well, what percent of that 70 is still working, and then some other, section of the population, as you say, there's no jobs to go to. because their businesses are closed. Everything that we did in community has been, I've been interested in thinking about how, you know, all of the public spaces are empty, which means everybody's at home, which means we do have buildings for everybody to be in for the most part. Obviously there are people who are homeless who don't have places to go. That, you know, it's like, what is the society like when most people are living at, you know, working from home, being at home, just, and not going out into a public space. It's this complete reversal of modernity from the public to the private.
Yes, and of course that whole social, I mean, we go to work obviously to make money and to pay the bills but there's a massive social aspect to it as well. Let's be honest about that. We meet with other people, and a lot of our friendships center around those connections we have at work and the like. And it's also one of the things that drove feminism, of course, right? It was that women that felt for many generations they'd been trapped at home and the boredom of it, and the, you know, even though they loved their kids, but just being there all day, every day, and doing not much else, they wanted to enjoy the social interaction that they felt men were enjoying by actually getting out of the house and going to work. So, as you say,
Right.
it'd be interesting to see in reversing that now, right? Putting all of us basically back in the house within those four walls,
right.
just what the impact will be socially and everything else. So, it's a very, as they say, may you live in interesting times. It's a very interesting time in that respect, but it's also, as we're going to discuss, in that sense, a traumatic time. There's no point, you know, it's a very stressful time too. It's incredibly stressful.
Oh no, it definitely, the stress and but my mother didn't work for the first 11 years of my life. She went back to work after my father left, and then, you know, carried on her medical practice, but she was always very busy at home, not have, you know, but I think what's different now, obviously, is we're not even being, you know, I think the United States, it's different state by state, the degree of isolation that we're in, but we're certainly not in the degree of isolation that the people in the UK are having to enforce this. Like, you can only be outside for an hour a day. I'm not aware of any of those sorts of restrictions in Chicago, that's for certain. So it's not just, I mean, I have a sort of meditation that I've been thinking about, that I want to write through, but in one sense, we're all Carthusians now, if that makes sense. I mean, it's particularly the people that have to live on their own, and maybe you have your studio apartment in a garden, and that's it, right? You know, the Carthusians were considered, you know, to a certain extent, you know, spiritual heroes, to be able to live in that kind of isolation and not have, they have some kind of regular interaction with the liturgy, but otherwise being alone in your cell, that's a very, very spiritually demanding life.
Yes. And I think one of the things that adds to this is that the dimension of compulsion and force. There seems to me to be a qualitative difference between something that is chosen, or that even if you do work from home, you know you can jump in the car if you want to and go up the street and get out of the place for a while and walk in the park. But you've got an external authority telling you that you must stay at home, and you've got police forces and regulators basically. So you lose that sense of control, I guess, over it. You know, I just think for many people that adds to the drama of it, that they can't control how they manage their lives. Someone else's sort of.
I think you're definitely right. And there's the sort of dual, like there's the political and military control that people are feeling potentially under, but there's also, I've been reading that, I haven't experienced this myself at all. I take my dog out for the walk in the park and everybody keeps distance and smiles at each other. But I understand, again, for example, in the UK, that people are being reported by their neighbors for being outside too long. And that, I mean, to me, that's the scariest thing, that feeling of distrust that seems to be developing, that people are not just that we're sort of adjusting in our social interactions not to touch each other, so that my husband pointed out, in a certain way, there's many ways in which we're going back to the 19th century. And one of the most interesting is, prior to, well, I know it's like pick dates, right? But prior to the prevalence of vaccines and penicillin, you could be, you were constantly in danger of contracting tuberculosis, for example, or polio, or measles, or chickenpox, and that the great spread of infectious diseases in the cities of the 19th century. I read somewhere recently 1 in 7 people were died of tuberculosis. That seems amazing. How could that be? That in fact most of the population was at risk of contracting tuberculosis.
We forget. I think I've shown it to you in the past, but I'm doing another book I'm finishing off at the moment, the life story of all things of the Mary Poppins author's father, Mr. Banks. And what part of that research involves her. She grew up as a child in Australia in that era before the war, before penicillin, just as vaccines were coming in. And in researching that, there was I forget the name of the United States pediatrician, but certainly across the British Empire, there was a guy called Truby King from New Zealand. And these two men coincidentally established what we today call maternal and child welfare kind of regimes for raising kids. And they predated, remember Dr. Ben Spock, they predated Dr. Spock, and their whole regime was based on that level of strictness. Mothers were not to kiss their babies, right? You did not kiss babies. You did not respond to crying babies. They had to learn the regime of fed when you fed them. You wouldn't, today, if you thought a baby was crying, they were hungry, you'd feed them under the post-Dr. Spock regime. In those days, those strict regimes and advices were given to mothers to raise children that way. And we often forget that. Like our grandparents were brought up as basically Truby King babies across Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. There was an American guy whose name I forget at the moment, but who had exactly the same regime, and that was used in the United States. But it was exactly the same methodology and the one you described, and it all predated and things like penicillin, and it did bring down the maternal and child death rate significantly when you didn't, as I said, didn't kiss babies. You didn't respond to them, right? And that all broke down at the same time. Dr. Spock wrote his first book in 1946, about the time of the Second World War, and of course we now live in that that Dr. Spock era. I suppose you might have been a Dr. Spock baby. I certainly was. I remember my mother always talking about Dr. Spock says this, Dr. Spock says that.
Oh no, my mom didn't do that.
No,
what she did was, so she had done her internship in pediatrics before I was born, and so what I tended to hear was about all the diseases that I could have had.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so I'm so thankful, to say, I'm so thankful you didn't get such and such, and I'm like, oh my goodness.
She was in the medical mindset, obviously.
Oh, constantly, yes. So, and I've been amused by the meme of all of this has been people hoarding toilet paper. My mother beats all of you already, right? She has toilet paper for the entire year stocked up on a regular basis, right? Because she knows that you need to be prepared. And when I was talking to her recently, she's saying, yeah, we haven't been out. They locked down weeks before anybody else did, right? With the canned foods and the toilet paper and such. And so, and she was born in 1938. So right before the Second World War started. There is, what you're describing is, yes, we've been in fact enjoying a sort of respite from many of the things that humanity had previously had to cope with, and the sort of shock of having to confront the problem of infectious disease at this scale is it's not unprecedented. It's just it's not familiar to those of us who are younger than my mom.
I think what you and I can bring to that today is that ancient wisdom in that sense. We're tapping into that great Christian archetype of death and resurrection. You've got extensive experience in going right back into the Middle Ages, and many of these things were, as you say, pre-modern medicine. And modern medicine, as we know it, is really only about 100 years old.
Yes.
In the sense of the technological advancements that we've had in medicine, like massive surgery and anesthesia and, as you say, antibiotics. and it's really only since the Second World War that really exponentially took off. A lot of soldiers died in the First World War from post-wound infection, and we remember how many people died in the Spanish flu pandemic, again,
right?
Because it was all pre-antibiotics and pre-serious antivirals, and many people died from the secondary infections they got after the virus got them, because we didn't have antibiotics to treat it. So all of this, as you say, is relatively new and to us, and it's the first time our society's experienced it. Which I have to say, when we first discussed the Resurrection Mantra last year, I think as you know, the book's in two parts. There's a part A and a part B. Part A to be honest, just an initial kind of backgrounder to why I came up with this idea. Describes a bit of my life and why I did it. And I've sort of said in the book that, if people want to go straight to the mantra, they can skip this section. But I have to say now, the thing that struck me is just how incredibly relevant that first section in this context has now become.
Could you say more about that?
Because it describes, a lot of my views after 30 or 40 years working in politics and issues management. It outlines the conclusion I came to long before this, that we'd kind of become over reliant, if you like, on let's call them, if you like, secular processes and models. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because even in the church and that, as you know, the word secular has a meaning. It means that the non-specifically religious or church-based entities.
The time of the age, right? Time of the age. So that's redundant. The saeculum is the age. It's the world that we live in time.
Yeah, and we've become heavily reliant on government processes, and again, this medical process, we've become reliant and become incredibly confident with it. And it dawned on me over a number of years that a lot of this actually wasn't working. This is before this, that it only got us so far, particularly in areas of trauma and mental health and people's spirituality, resilience, and capacity to cope. That yes, while we'd come up with things like penicillin, we'd extended the people's life expectancy, and we'd invented things like air conditioners to make our lives comfortable and cars to get around in and all this kind of stuff. It was all very good. So the engineering had produced or improved our comfort levels, if you like, but it hadn't necessarily improved our inner life or our spirituality. And this was having consequences across society. In fact, in the last 50 years, in my view, my observation is that had declined significantly as we grew more in confidence, and almost a kind of arrogant confidence in that secular capacity to deal with things. So that was sort of the background and I just summarized that in the first part of the book and how I came to that conclusion. And I thought this simple spiritual exercise would help people rebalance, not to do away with the good things on that side, but just to rebalance things, recalibrate things, so you can enjoy both sides of it, if you like, and really get the most out of life by having that balance corrected. Now we can see just how, in light of what's happened now, we can see just how exposed that other side is.
Yes, well, I'd say, as a historian, I'd say, can you see the screen? I'm showing some pictures.
Yes, now. I can. Yep.
Yeah. So this is, of course, the map that everybody is now completely familiar with. It's the Johns Hopkins tracking of the virus, and I'd say, the graphical representation is quite powerful, and that we're going to have great red splotches all over the world, and 1 million confirmed cases and 58,000 now total deaths confirmed out of 225,000 recovered. These are alarming numbers for most people to look at, and the early, I think a few weeks ago, I was posting on my social media some comparative statistics. I haven't been looking at them more recently, but I mean, I'm sure more than 58,000 people have died of many other causes in the last few weeks than have died of the virus. So exactly how frightened are we meant to be in this circumstance? And I think your meditation in your book on the degree to which we expect never to have to cope with death is actually quite telling.
Well, when you compare it, I'm not sure if you have in your work, but I've certainly on a number of books that I've been researching touched on the Spanish flu pandemic because they had impacts on the people I'm writing about. And while we certainly did close theatres and things like that for about 6 to 8 months, not all of society closed like it's closing this time. And certainly in Australia, for example, we had 15,000 deaths. We did a bit better. You had a terrible experience in the United States, where the first cases were found. They originated at Fort Riley over in Kansas.
Okay.
And there's some speculation that it was actually the doughboys entering World War One that actually spread the virus. Right? It was the United States Army moving to Europe in 1917 that from places like Fort Riley that spread the virus into which is where it then quickly spread, and then it was returning soldiers after the war that brought it to places back to the United States and back to places like Australia and so on. That's sort of the general theory about what happened. And so the United States, certainly over 300,000 deaths in the United States. It was quite horrendous. And 15,000 in Australia. So none of us are anywhere near those figures, right?
Right.
At this stage, and heaven forbid we ever get anything like that, But that was the magnitude of the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago to the day.
Well, and I mean, this is Peter. The view of the world from the past. I think that we, to a certain extent, thought we'd escaped, right? And there is that. Always that hubris that we have to cope with as either with science or progressive politics or just power of the Industrial Revolution and the claim. And I teach my course on the history of European civilization. We look at the Crystal Palace and the promise that in the mid 19th century industry seemed to have of making everyone's life comfortable. And you're saying it's like we're having a different experience now from things being shut in 1918. Of course, you and I can still be talking. We couldn't have done that in 1918. I think we have a sort of weird sort of luxury thanks to the kinds of communication that we're able to sustain now that we can shut everything down. I have thought about that. It's like you if you can carry on my teaching or other kinds of work with everything shut, then I think it is going to make us thoughtful about both the value of being together physically, which I think we will discover we really want, but also the sort of luxury that we have of being able to continue in our conversations even when we're not face to face. Whether this is going to change humanity, how is it going to change us? Is it going to make us more appreciative of our physical existence and consider that more precious and valuable? I think one of the things that the social media revolution has brought about is we think we don't really need our bodies, right? You can play on social media without ever having to admit that you live. But on the other hand, now we recognize that we do actually, we are incarnate, not just consciousnesses or voices.
I think that's right. And I think what I'm saying is that that first part of my book, which sort of describes that, and it doesn't describe the mantra itself, that's in part 2, but that describes that social, political, religious background to the last 50 years, 60 years. It just surprises me the extent to which this has now revealed that to be more accurate than I thought. I mean, it was just my personal reflection and observations after years of experience in the political world and so on. And I'm just now, I'm a little bit stunned at the extent to which that.
How do you mean exactly?
In the sense, as I say, that I think we did get a lot of. I saw it in the political. A lot of hubris did build into the system. That we thought we were bulletproof. We thought we were invincible. That we could solve every problem just by, as you say, by that engineering slash science slash government legislation, government program, you know. And I just, it's not clear that's true. We can mitigate these things. We can manage them through, but we can't. We're not bulletproof, and
Right.
we have to restore that balance to be able to cope with these types of massive setbacks. So this is, for a lot of people, going to be a massive setback, particularly if it lasts for 4, 5, 6 months.
Oh, well, I understand. I saw something. Are you in Australia now under lockdown for 6 months?
Pretty much.
But you
they're
do
talking
have
6 months. Yeah, they're talking 6 months.
or until a vaccine is. I mean, so that's like we're living in the world post vaccines, or now no longer post vaccine. And what you and I were talking about a little earlier, things like the measles. Measles are vastly more infectious even than the coronavirus, COVID-19, and yet we've sort of been kind of blissfully not needing to worry about them for some decades.
And I think what we're not discussing yet, and for obvious reasons, because there's a lot on our plate, is that this notion that in 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever months, that somehow or other you're just going to say, righto, we've got that licked.
Right.
Back
well,
to
that's
work.
I do have just, no, we're not, right? And this is
happen. That's right. It's not going to happen. You just can't go like those shops I was describing, that I was watching on Monday afternoon. You're not just going to be able to, after 6 months, just go back, open the door, and think everyone's just going to rock up the next day, and your restaurant's going to be full again. It's just not going to be like that. So,
well, especially since when I went grocery shopping this past week, the spices were all gone. Clearly, people are cooking, right? Yeah. And there, I'd given myself the most perfect segue to, yes, the spices were all gone. Do you remember the Black Death, right? And you say, look at this map, and what is it showing, and what date is it showing us? Well, look, there's a giant blotch of death in China, and somehow it gets to Italy first.
Oh goodness! Right? Yeah, right.
Right, and this is the Black Death, right, from 1347, 1348, and although it hit in China a few years before that, and then traveled along, in effect, the spice route, traveled across Eurasia along the Silk Route, and had its first impact in Italy, and then spread throughout Europe. The deja vu in the transmission for me is of course interesting, but that and this is the next picture is showing the trade routes that were active in the Middle Ages prior to the spread of the plague, and saying, this is we like to imagine ourselves as being particularly specially global in the late 20th, early 21st century, but in fact there have been other periods in the history of humanity in which things have been highly interconnected, and unfortunately in those periods has also been when disease spreads most rapidly. And one of the things that happened, this is a quite sobering graphic for me, is that the plague became endemic in Europe after 1348. There's a terrible spike in 1347, 1352, but after that, I mean, one of the things that we're practicing with quarantine right now is something that developed over the course of the late 14th and 15th centuries, of recognizing that when plague hits, you shut the city, or that the ship can't dock. Exactly what, to the degree that we're going to have to develop new measures of normal containment is obviously one of those great questions.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because we've been discussing that here. Like, my son was actually scheduled to be going on a holiday to the United States in about 2 or 3 weeks. Now that's of course cancelled,
right,
or on hold. And I said, even if we reopen our societies internally, I said, you have to wonder, without a vaccine, whether we can really fully open them externally for at least 12 months to 18 months.
Right.
Because as you see there, and the same thing happened with the Spanish flu. It was the second phase of the Spanish flu that was the most deadly. They did knock it off the first time to some extent. They thought they'd beaten it, and it came back with a gusto, right? a second time and did all the damage. So if we can suppress it, like Australia has pretty much, Australia seems to be, we're at about 27, 28 deaths, which is pretty, by international standards, is pretty low. And we're down at about 0.3% death rate against known infections.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so we could probably get to a point theoretically, right, where we could reopen the internal society, but it's still running amok throughout the world.
Well, and this is our problem, right? That we want to live in the night. This is the next map is. You want to date it?
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, they've discovered Australia, right? In inverted commas, discovered Australia. Yeah.
Yes, but the one of the after effects, it's like we still all kind of want to live in the British Empire, at least those of us who speak English.
Yeah.
And the degree of interconnection, I mentioned the Crystal Palace from 1850, right? Now, I hate when I'm on camera and I can't remember my dates off the top of my head. 1881.
Yeah, you mean the big international fair at the Crystal Palace?
Right, and this was a map. This is a map that's showing that range of the empire's reach, which was from England to India, England to South Africa, to India, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, and I suppose it's amazing that there wasn't more, plague and infectious disease in the 19th and early 20th century. So we're talking about the Spanish flu that spread, right? And it's the obverse of the opening of all these trade routes, which is everything travels, people and goods and pathogens.
I guess the one we don't often talk about now, because we've basically beaten them with antibiotics, but certainly prior to antibiotics, the other one the other ones that were actually a very big problem, and certainly also during the First World War, were the sexually transmitted diseases.
Yes.
Probably before the Spanish flu, the biggest problem amongst soldiers was syphilis, and there was a whole range of laws were brought in, I believe so, even in the United States, about sexual activity, soldiers, and warnings about protecting yourself against STDs and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, we've got AIDS now, of course, which gave us a heck of a shock, and it's still, but we certainly don't have the problem with syphilis and the like that we had back then. But that was sort of spread through those kind of trade routes, I suspect, as well. Would that be a fair?
Right. Well, and that potentially takes us to another kind of conversation about the effect this is going to have on people's sexual lives. I was in college when the AIDS crisis hit, so I remember that as an immediate anxiety when people didn't know how widespread it was. There were projections of greater death than at least in the United States we've experienced. Although in Africa, obviously, it's very significant problem. We're right now with the coronavirus, we're in that period when we're not quite sure exactly how deadly it is, and whether or not, if we get enough ventilators, will it be like having the vaccine? You'll be able to treat it, and you'll know how to deal with it when it presents, and it turns into one of those many things that we already have cures for.
Yeah.
Like the plague, right? Most people don't worry about the Black Death anymore, because if you can diagnose it correctly, there are treatments.
Yeah. And I guess the same. We're always worried about polio and as well. They're sort of, even though we've sort of beaten them in our sort of countries, I guess there's always that fear that they're still lurking there somewhere if we don't remain vigilant.
Right. But I'd say, we're dealing with a different kind of problem. You're saying, are we, you and I have been right now, but just been talking about the secular solutions. We need, the social distancing and the vaccines, and we'll develop better practices as societies for, what kind of contact is appropriate with strangers and how close we want to be. But, there is a spiritual dimension.
Well, that's right. There's a big I mean, you've described it as transformative, which I thought was a very good word. And that this is very transformative. I even think even more than AIDS and those things. I mean, in the end, like we didn't close all the shops with AIDS.
Right.
We certainly, I mean, I don't think we can understate the impact, the economic impact of what's going on here. I've looked at it upside down, inside out, and from every angle, and it's just, I don't think it's quite dawned on us all just what's happened here. It seems to have dawned on some leaders like Trump, and I think our prime ministers. I think they're starting to realise just the magnitude, the financial and economic magnitude of this, more than we've even more than like again, even in the war, they didn't. I mean, people were sleeping together, living together in London, you know, in the underground. They weren't locked in houses, socially distanced, you know, from each other, and they were still able to get up in the morning, and a lot of them go to work. You see all those war photos,
right.
For all of the trauma of that. So that human interaction still occurred. This is, as you say, changed how we interact with each other, plus basically closed our societies down except for key industries and the ones that we can keep alive online. Now, what the long-term impact of that will be is anyone's guess, but at the moment we can see the kind of dollar values that are stacking up to try and prevent complete social panic. This is money like we've never seen before. You know.
Well, I've also, I think that's true, but I've also, again, I've been reading all of the press releases that the university sends out, and my colleagues are busy trying to think this through from a number of different angles. One of the pieces I saw is just, well, on the other hand, insofar as we keep people from dying, that is, you know, we don't tend to, there's a problem with economics in the way it calculates things, and life is precious, and most of the economic projections tend to focus on business losses. But if you think about it in terms of lives saved, and you know, the productive, you know, so you want to do it economically, the productivity of the people who are still going to be alive because we've hopefully shut down things quickly enough, which is a huge question everybody has, obviously. But insofar as life is precious, you know, maybe this will make the economists rethink the way in which they define value. That's
right. But I guess what I'm saying is, though, I'm not casting a judgment on either side of it. What I'm saying is, though, the impact is there. So as coming back to our point about the spirituality of it, it's hitting us from every direction, quite significantly. So the challenge is part 2 of my book. You know, okay, you're at a fork in the road, right? We really are at a fork in the road here, and it's going to. So the spiritual. Well, what do you do about that? What is your response to that? So in 6 months' time, when you've got to go back to a closed down coffee shop that you were doing really well in for years until this command and control government action came in, and so what's your state of mind going to be when you've basically got to reconfront, almost reestablishing that business,
mm-hmm.
Going back, or as you say, well, losing a loved one through this. You've got the grief, as you say. Grief has economic impact. Grief can make people dysfunctional.
Yes.
So as you say, you lose that person's productivity because they just can't operate. And
but there's also this mindset. Calculus. The picture I'm showing now is August Pugin's one from his contrasts, right? Showing the same town in 1840 and in 1440. And the bottom picture is the 1441. And as far as he was concerned, by the mid-19th century, the world had lost most of its value because it had lost its faith. And he's showing it architecturally that in 1440, you have a Catholic town that's full of churches and full, therefore, of worship. And by 1840, you have, in the foreground of the picture, a prison. To one side where there had been a church, there's gasworks and an insane asylum. In the town, instead of having all of the different the spires for the different churches dedicated to different saints, you have different chapels. So the fracturing of Christianity, and different the Socialist Hall of Science. He's mainly concerned with the breakup of Christianity, but saying, one thing that's very interesting, of course, is, Sunday is Palm Sunday. for the Western tradition, and no churches are open.
This will be a very unique experience for many people.
Yes.
It's a very good point, right? But it also brings us to this story of the resurrection. Man, Palm Sunday, as I described here's Jesus Christ in that archetypal story. Here's Jesus Christ, popular, being waved into town. His life's going along pretty well. He's successful.
Mm-hmm.
He's got all these followers. Then within a week, it's a disaster.
Right.
Right? It's and then Friday, it's just a mess. One of his friends has ratted on him. Other friends have denied him and didn't want to. Was scared, in fear, thought they'd get implicated in it too, and strung up on a cross. He's got everyone running helter-skelter to disown him. He's got the mob baying for his blood. He's got terrified authorities, legalistic authorities, trying to stop him. After the week before, he's got all this, wonderful, successful life that's just imploded. And then we've got Saturday. You've kind of got this dull nothingness, and you can imagine the depression amongst his followers. They've all scattered, and then Sunday, they've kind of woken up and sort of started to get their thought processes together. A couple of them have gone to the tomb, and all of a sudden there's new life. It's different life, but it's new life. So we've gone from things going along really well, swimmingly, very popular, crash, implosion, right? Disorientation, through to new life. And that's basically, seems to me, the point that needs to be reinstilled in people's mindsets and in their being. And that's the point of the resurrection mantra. Instill that way of thinking in yourself. That was in for the believer, for the Christian believer, that is God saying, look, you're free people. I'm not going to interfere in your freedom, but that's how life is. And you've got to have confidence and hope that even when these things happen, no matter how bad it gets on Friday and how dissolute and disoriented you are on Saturday, right, there will be a Sunday. And that's not just something you intellectualize. It's not just something, you can't just say to someone, oh, it'll all be okay. And all. No, that a person has to take that and internalize it as their worldview, as their outlook. And that's, of course, where that's the role of a spiritual exercise, as I see it, is to take an intellectual concept, to take a true story, the true myth, as Tolkien called it, right? To take that and make it part of your life, part of your personal disposition and outlook on life. So when you go back to that closed cafe and are confronted with the mountain to climb to rebuild your business and rebuild your life, to have that disposition that says, well, yeah, all right, it mightn't be the same business, but I can do it, or I can do something else. I can get there. I can do it. There will be new life. There is hope. And I think seems to me, that's the story. That's the story that has to be spread rapidly through society in a situation like this. Otherwise, as I said, we're at a fork in the road. You can go that road, or you can go into despair and say, all's lost. I've lost my job. I've lost everything. I've lost my house. I've lost, right? And
right.
What's it going to be? This is a serious matter. It's going to be a serious matter for me, probably in the United States, possibly tens of millions of people. In Australia, hundreds of thousands, millions by pro rata basis. But, I think I saw some figures there where I think in the United States already 6 million people, and they're estimating up to 25 million will be basically on the unemployment queues.
Right.
That's
well, and it is.
That's a lot of people. That's a hell of a lot of people.
And it's a huge. I mean, it's a huge. Well, it's interesting. It's a huge problem if you don't have this story to anchor you.
That's right.
In
That's
your
right.
hope.
Yep.
And the United States, we're a weirdly religious country, even with our separation of church and state. And what you were saying earlier about the problem of compulsion. I mean, it's interesting how I mean, I'm impressed at how calmly everybody has taken the shutdown over the last few weeks, right? And that is hopeful in the sense that, you know, we are actually functioning well as a society, because immediately once the scale of the danger became clear to people, everybody said, okay, fine, we'll shift. You know, it is a little nervous making how people are going to deal with it. Right now, we feel like we're in crisis mode, and you know, by Christmas it'll be over. By April it'll be over. You know, whichever, you're suddenly in the middle of a war and you don't know quite how long it's going to last, and you can keep up hope for a certain amount of time, but we are going to have to keep up hope indefinitely. And yet we had to do that all along in the first place. I mean, I talked about how, you know, devastating it was when my father died, and my husband was terrified. I was like, I cried for a year every single day, because my father had been very significant to me in lots of ways, not because he was perfect or, you know, always there, although he really was kind of always there, even though he wasn't always there. You know, that you're suddenly grieving all of the things that you had projected into your future, and the disappointment and the grief is as much your own imagination as it is indeed what was going to happen, because we never knew what was going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I didn't know my father was going to die from, you know, one Friday to the next, and there it was, bang, he had an embolism, he had a stroke and an embolism, and he was gone. And you know, I could say I spent the first week that I was coping with it, and my husband and I were clearing out his house in denial, because you think, well, maybe if I do this well, we clean the house, if we sort all of the material, you know, all the stuff, that will fix it and he'll be back. And of course he's not. There's the before and after of when he was alive and when he isn't. And one of the interesting things that I found in that moment was lots of other people's parents had died too. So you know, it's that thing that happens and you don't know how you're going to survive it, and then it does happen and you do survive it, because, well, why? I mean, that was so interesting. And of course, one of the things that helped me get through it was going to church and singing about the resurrection, and just crying every single time I sang, you know, this is, and now I'm blanking on the song that we sang. It was in Spanish, and it was Resucito, right? I will rise. And that seems like an insane sort of promise most of the time. And yet it's also so real. I mean, I'm showing the picture right now of the heavenly Jerusalem, right? Which is the new heaven and new earth that we are hoping for in the long run, with the second coming of Christ and the restoration of the world. Right now, people are just going to mainly be, you know, rebuilding their daily lives, their social lives, their friendships, their families, learning how to cook.
That's right, and this, and I think, as you know, in the Resurrection Mantra, one of the steps of getting into the mantra is to diarize events in your life where you took a hit like that, like, you know, and then to look at how you were going, how your life was going up to the point of that particular setback or crisis, the impact of the setback or crisis that you've just described with regard to your father's death, and then what happened as time went on, and how does that new life look after the event, once you work through the event. This is not, of course, magic. We're not suggesting grief, and the setback is a real setback. It's not a game. It's really painful. Good Friday was really painful, and it was deadly. Nails were driven into his body, and right, it wasn't all just lifted off him. It's not that type of thing. It's moving through that experience in the knowledge, even though you haven't got the new life right now. You're not resurrected right now necessarily, but it's coming. It'll be there. There will be new life. And I think it allows you, certainly been my experience, it allows you to, in those moments of trauma and crisis, to maintain your capacity to think properly and to keep your bearings.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can, as I say, or you can just descend into despair, descend into a living hell. And you see that, like the experience you described of losing your dad. Some people move actually into chronic grief. They go for, you say you went for a year. Year's about right normally,
It
as
was
far
a
as I know.
year. It was a full year
Yeah,
every single
yeah.
day.
But some people are there 5 or 10 years later,
Yeah.
Rachel. Still, right? They've never triggered out of it. They have descended. They've taken that other road into bitterness and sullenness and never, forgotten how to smile. Um, and there'll be a lot of this because you've described that the experience of death. So even though we sort of tend to deny it, we do know really that it happens to us all. It is a leveler. What isn't always a leveler is financial crisis, which is going to hit now. Financial crisis is often
Right.
dealt with differently. The humiliation of going broke, right? And we've often put a moral dimension to it. You know what I mean? Oh, you must have been reckless with your money, or you must have done something stupid. And so people feel the embarrassment and it's highly likely you didn't feel embarrassed that your father died, right?
No, but my father went bankrupt.
Oh well, that's another. Well, yeah, but that was, yeah. but death doesn't, unless it's, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. It can be depending on the circumstances, but just a standard medical death usually often isn't necessarily embarrassing. It's traumatic, but it's not. Whereas, you sort of think your neighbours are looking at you, and you've lost your house, you've lost all your money.
Right.
The level of despair can often not be understood, unless you've looked at it and then thought, well, how do I get out of this?
Well, definitely the shame,
Yeah,
that sense of, I mean, I mentioned earlier that the way people are shaming each other about staying inside or doing their proper social distancing. Yes,
yeah.
that there will be, I hadn't considered that the degree to which people will blame each other if things don't turn out well
And even
in the next few
themselves,
months.
but even the
Yeah.
despair themselves. Oh, I've lost all my money. I haven't got any money left. I've lost. How do I get? It can be really, really terrifying experience.
Yeah.
How do I get some money? How do I make some money? How do I get out of this hole I'm in? It's a, and that's where you've just got to. You actually will. And it's in those moments that you've got to be able to. That hope gives you the capacity to solve the problems, to think, even though it's not always immediately obvious, but it gives you that methodology, that process to live in hope and work your way out of it, even in the darkest moments and the sleepless nights. That's what that's what Jesus, with you I will die and rise again. That's the point. As painful as it gets, take that road and internalize that idea. Internalize that idea with a mantra. Don't just think it intellectually, because that doesn't really get you very far in the end. It's got to be in your disposition. It's got to be habitual, an habitual response to trauma. And then when it gets this bad, it's got to really be ingrained in you. You've got to really get it ingrained in you, or despair is never far away. That's what I think. I think we saw that in the 20th century. We had the First World War, the Depression, or the Spanish flu, the Depression, and the Second World War, and we saw a considerable amount of social dislocation. I
Mm-hmm.
think in many respects our societies are still getting over that period. A lot of this kind of secular nonsense, postmodern wokeism and all that, it's an attempt to try and control the trauma that arose, the social trauma that arose across our societies as a result of those experiences. They were incredibly global traumas, and in response to it through the 60s and that, we said, well, we're not going back there. We're not going through all that again. We need a new way of doing things. And we threw out the spirituality. Gradually, we started to throw out the spirituality, is my reading of it. And that's what I saw in
Yes.
my political life. That's my observation in that book in part one. We threw it out, and that has introduced a whole new risk. And especially now, and in another, when we hit another global trauma of this magnitude,
Mm-hmm.
that in my view, needs to be reinstilled in our societies, and that's what I'm offering here, and that's what I think we're offering in this talk to people. Try and it's not complicated. It's not some great um, our complicated spiritual contemplative method or anything like that. It's quite a simple thing, just to instill it in yourself, that notion of, well, we'll get there. We will get through this. There is death and resurrection. That's the great true myth of Western civilization. And now increasingly more other civilizations who are picking up that Christian story. But that's the truth of life. That no matter how bad it gets, there will be new life. And put that.
But I think I like what you're saying. It's not something you can think. Just, like, will it, sort of, if I just, magic would be if I say this mantra over and over and over again, it'll all fix everything, right? And you're saying it's not magic. It needs to be, this for Christians is this willingness to imitate Christ, not only at death, but also the picture I'm showing now is, his temptation in the desert. When the devil comes to him and, says, well, if you worship me, it'll all be fixed, right? Which is the temptation of magic, which is in the financial considerations that people are going to be in, that'll be very, very tempting to say, if we worship our economic health above all, everything will be fixed. And of course, in Christ's temptation, one of the things that the devil promised him was like, command these stones to be bread, and you'll be able to eat. And that sense of saying, no, we do need to recover our sense of, we don't live by bread alone. We have to have our spiritual undergirding. Otherwise, we're simply serving Satan, and we'll never get out of the dislocation and despair that many people had fallen into even before the virus hit.
That's right. Yep, I agree with that entirely. And like you will still have to rebuild that business. As I said, it won't be there by magic, but you need that hope. You need that spiritual strength and that spiritual knowledge reaffirmed and in your disposition to assist you to get on with it. It's not, and that's, or alternatively, you can just drop your bundle, right? And so it's all too hard. And there will be people, you will see people who do that. And lots of people did that after the First World War. Other people like our friend Tolkien and that, again, some people went that route and went with hope and built and wrote some of the greatest pieces of literature, and so on. A lot of other people dropped their bundle, the Roaring Twenties, and everyone just, as you say, worshipped the economic, and we're not going to go through that again. We're going to live and be free and enjoy the day. And then that all hit the wall in 1929, right? And again, and so then the economy collapsed, and then we had another war, and lots of people were, had the Defense Department knocking on their door with a telegram saying their son had been. So all that trauma was revisited again. Right?
Well, the reason, I said my mother was born in 1938, and she's got all that toilet paper right now because she's born in 1938, so right before the Second World War starts. But she remembered her mother being very frugal as she was growing up, and not taking for granted that the material comforts are always going to be there, that you need to prepare for the future and need to. I worry that, I always worry about the prepping sort of mentality and saying, well, we just get enough toilet paper, we'll all be safe, right? And it's like that. It's not quite the way it works.
No.
But on the other hand, a willingness to accept that adversity is possible, and yet between the flagellation and the resurrection is both part of the same story, that we have. Socially, I think that willingness to be able to be shamed is very, very complicated and tricky, but I'm not sure which is the harder of these two pictures to look at, the flagellation or the resurrection. the sense of hope and glory and delight and, Lord, you're there, that the women are experiencing, versus, we're very willing to accept this whipping.
And there'll be there'll be a lot of self-flagellation, just because of, as I said, the sheer, and lots of people like on these unemployment queues now will be the kind of people you wouldn't traditionally think you would find on. You know what I mean? We sometimes have these images of people on unemployment queues, which are often unfair, but still large numbers of people who would never have dreamed this is where they were going to be. are going to be
Right.
there. And we have to, it's that spiritual strength, in my view, I firmly believe will get them through. And I would invite people to look very closely at this story and to internalize it through something like this mantra, um, to get them through, and to avoid and not take the road of despair. Don't drop your bundle. There is a way through this. You've got to find it in your own life, your own story, but there is new life after death. And it's very important to make that a central part of your life's belief system, in my view. And that's what we're offering here with the Resurrection Mantra. And
It's a wonderful place to end.
Thank you.
So say the mantra again clearly so people know what it is.
Jesus, with you, I will die and rise again. Jesus, with you, I will die and rise again. Now, you can make a variant of that. You can change it around with little words, but it's very simple. And just say that, 5 or 10 minutes every day, as you're going to bed at night. And lots of people, sleepless nights are going to be a very key feature of a lot of people's lives as well in this. This is a very good way to calm down the day as you're lying in bed. So this is not a complicated, you don't need complicated postures and, contemplative lotus positions and all this. Just lie in bed and just say this. Get yourself some prayer beads or rosary beads. You don't have to use rosary beads just to say the rosary, just counting beads of some sort if you need those to help you. Just get into bed and your mind's busy, you're distressed, you're worried, you're nervous, your bank balance is shot to pieces. You just need to calm all that down and get a good night's sleep. And one of the best ways to remind yourself as you're going into that deep sleep that there will be new life, no matter how bad this seems to look. There will be new life. Jesus, with you, I will die and rise again.
Amen. Well, I hope everyone, this does give you some hope, and both John and I we'll be praying with you and hopefully sharing your prayers with us. Thank you so much, John, for spending this hour with me in contemplation and reflection, and yet again for writing the Resurrection Mantra to help guide people in adopting this practice, particularly now in a moment when we needed it before, but we need it even more now. So thank you very much for coming on my video with me.
Thank you, Rachel, for another wonderful conversation. That was really very interesting. I think people will, even the historical aspects of it, will get a lot out of that. I think it's very interesting work that you've done there on the Black Death.
Thank you.
So
God bless.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.